We're on the very top of DAF Vav at the Mishnah. Hamachanes ma'os. If a person slowly accumulates cash, so he sort of just drops pennies in the jar, and va'omer harei elu lishkali, and he says as he's slowly accumulating that this accumulated amount will become for my machatzis shekel donation, and then he discovers when he counts the pennies that he's got more than what he needed. So then Beis Shammai omrim mosaran nedava, uBeis Hillel omrim mosaran chulin. Beis Shammai say that whatever surplus is considered to be hektish and has to be donated for, you put it in the special pushka for nedava stuff, for gift offerings, and that's separate from the machatzis shekel. And Beis Hillel say that any surplus you can pocket. It was never made hektish in the first place. In your house, like your own personal... it's right into your own glass jar in your house. Sha'avi mehen shkali, shavin shahamosar chulin. If, however, you make a declaration every time you drop a penny in the jar that from this shall be my machatzis shekel, then it's as if you're explicitly stating that only until I get up to the amount that I need shall it be sanctified, and therefore even Beis Shammai agree that whatever surplus is there shall be chulin. Elu lechatasi shavin shahamosar nedava. And furthermore, if you drop pennies in a jar to accumulate enough money to purchase an animal for a korban chatas, then even if, let's say, you need only $45, and when you count the pennies you have $50, nevertheless, that leftover $5 needs to be donated to the Beis HaMikdash as nedava. And we'll explain why in just a moment. Sha'avi mehen chatasi shavin shahamosar chulin. If, however, every time you drop a penny in, you say, from this shall be my chatas, so then it's almost like explicitly stating that you don't want any surplus to be sanctified, and therefore the surplus is chulin. Amar Rabbi Shimon, ma bein shkolim lechatos. Rabbi Shimon speaks it out. Why is there a difference between the law of shkolim and the law of chatos, whereas by the law of shkolim, the leftover, according to Beis Hillel, is chulin, and the leftover for a chatas is hektish? Ela shel shkolim yesh lahem kitzva v'lachatos ein la kitzva. The answer is very simple. The shkolim has a fixed amount, so therefore when you're dropping pennies in, it's with the specific intent implicit that you only want to accumulate a half a shekel worth of pennies, and that should be sanctified and no more. Whereas by a korban chatas, some animals are $40, some are $45, some are $50, so you don't necessarily have a descript specific amount in mind when you're dropping in the pennies. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, af lishkolim ein lahen kitzva. But Rabbi Yehuda argues with that, and he says, but wait a minute, sometimes the machatzis shekel does not have a fixed amount, and I'll prove it to you. Shekesha'alu Yisrael min hagola hayushoklin darkonos chazu lishkol slaim, chazu lishkol taboyin, bikshu lishkol dinarim velo kiblu mehen. We're going to see the story in more detail momentarily, but when the Jewish people came back from Bavel to build the second Beis HaMikdash with Ezra, they were called upon to give more than the half shekel initially, because they needed extra funds in order to purchase the building materials. So therefore, originally people gave darkonos, which is 1.5 shekels. Then they were called upon the following year to give full shekels. The following year they gave only half shekels, and the following year they wanted to give 1/4 of a shekel, which is a dinner, and that they did not accept. Amar Rabbi Shimon, afal pikein yad kulan shaveh. So Rabbi Shimon says, but that's not a good argument. In other words, Rabbi Yehuda is arguing that you see sometimes historically the machatzis shekel fluctuates. Rabbi Yehuda says, but that's different, because even during those historical periods when the Jews were called on to give more, everyone gave a uniform amount. Every single Jew had to give the same amount. Here, when it comes to purchasing an animal for a korban chatas, you might purchase an animal for this much, I'll purchase an animal for that much. So there's fluctuation even within that period of time when we're all bringing the korban chatas. When it comes to a chatas, one person pays a sela, another person pays 2 selas, and another person pays 3. So there's no uniform amount at any given time. And that's why, if you accumulate pennies for a korban chatas, we basically say that anything that's left over is hektish. The Gemara now says, Hamachanes v'chulei, talking about accumulating pennies. Rabbi Yossi b'shem Rabbi Elazar, ma pligin b'machanes prot. The only time there's a machlokes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is if you're slowly accumulating pennies in a jar. Aval ba'omer elu lishkali kol amamodi shahamosaran nedava. But if you make a statement as follows, you take a fistful of coins and you say, this is for my machatzis shekel, so then everyone would agree that only the amount that you need for a machatzis shekel is sanctified, and everything else is sanctified for nedava. Meaning that the leftover, even though Beis Hillel hold that the leftover is chulin in the case of our Mishnah, that's because you're slowly accumulating penny by penny. But when you're making a declaration on a fistful of coins, so then you've sort of sanctified everything at the same time, and therefore everything is kodesh, even according to Beis Hillel. Rabbi Chia v'Rebbi Biba b'shem Rabbi Elazar ma pligin b'mechanes prot aval ba'omer elu lishkali koli alma moda shahamosar and chulin. Rav Bibi argues. Rav Bibi says no, just the opposite. Only in a case where you are slowly accumulating coins do you say that each penny is sanctified as you put it in the jar. But if you are holding a fistful of coins and you say that this is for the machatzis shekel, then only the amount that you need is going to be sanctified, and even according to Beis Shammai, the rest will not be sanctified. Okay? So therefore, you see two different perspectives as to the attitude of the difference between slow accumulation of coins versus making a declaration on a group of coins all at the same time. Amar Rabbi Chia Masnisa Messiah Rabbi Bibi. Our Mishnah supports Rav Bibi, who says that when you grab a fistful at one time, then the leftover is chulin according to everybody. How? Ditnan Amar Reb Shimon Ma ben shkolim lechatas. Reb Shimon tries to draw a distinction between shkolim and a korban chatas, where we said that the leftover of shkolim, according to Beis Hillel, is chulin, and yet the leftover of the korban chatas money is going to be nedava. So Reb Shimon draws a distinction as follows. He says, Ela shahashkolim yesh lahen kitzva, ulechatas ein la kitzva. That the difference between shkolim and chatas is that shkolim has a fixed amount, and chatas does not have a fixed amount. So let's analyze that line. Let's analyze that argument of Reb Shimon. Ma anan kayomin. What's the case? Like heichi dami. What's the case? Im ba'omer sha'avi mehen shkoli. If Reb Shimon's talking about a case where a person says explicitly, I'm only going to bring from this my machatzis shekel, so then kol amma modi shahamosar and chulin, and im ba'omer sha'avi mehen chatasi kol amma modi shahamosar chulin. Then there really is no distinction between the machatzis shekel and the chatas, because in both cases, if you made that express statement, then in both cases the surplus is chulin. Ela kain anu kayamin ba'omer elu lishkali, but rather we're talking about a person who's slowly accumulating coins, and he's saying, this is for my shekel, or this is for my chatas. Shkolim al yedei shekitzvasan min haTorah mosaran chulin. Chatas al yedei she'in kitzvasan min haTorah mosaran nedava. So the argument that he's trying to make is as follows. You see that Rabbi Shimon is trying to suggest that any time something has a fixed amount, it's impossible to sanctify more than what the fixed amount is. So if that's the argument, so then it shouldn't make a difference, says the Gemara, whether you are holding a fistful at one time or whether you're slowly accumulating it. According to Reb Shimon, anytime something has a fixed amount, nothing beyond that fixed amount can be sanctified. And if that's the case, this supports Rav Bibi's contention that when you pick up a fistful of coins and you say, this is for my shekel, then the surplus is chulin and not like Rabbi Yossi, but rather a support of Rabbi Bibi. So the Gemara's question is, Ma Ovid la Rabbi Yossi b'shem Rabbi Eliezer. So what's Rabbi Yossi going to do with this argument, and how is he going to explain Reb Shimon? He says, Pasrala b'machnis prot to Beis Hillel. He'll tell you that Reb Shimon's argument only applies when you're slowly accumulating the coins, as Beis Hillel had said, that only there is the surplus chulin. But if you make a declaration with the coins concomitantly in your hands, so then the declaration of this is for the shekel is a declaration of hektish on everything that you're holding. The only time that Reb Shimon's argument holds any force is when you're slowly accumulating. So the slow accumulation, because the machatzis shekel has a fixed value, does not allow any pennies that accumulate afterwards to become holy. But if they're all being sanctified at the same time, then even though there's only a fixed amount to the machatzis shekel, all of the coins can be sanctified.
Because you can't decide which is and which isn't?
I suppose. Or it's really a psychological sort of assessment that the guy wants everything to be sanctified in his hand. So now the Gemara's question is as follows. We're going to see, as soon as we turn the page, we're going to see another Mishnah. And the next Mishnah tells us that anything that's left over from your machatzis shekel coins has a din of chulin. So how does Rabbi Yossi deal with that if he says that the surplus is nedava? The Gemara answers, Pasula b'machanes prot uchabeis Hillel. He'll explain that Mishnah is talking about the same case as our Mishnah, that it's talking about where you slowly accumulate pennies in a jar. Only there do we say that the extra monies are chulin. But if you make a declaration on a fistful of coins, everything is sanctified. Next, hamafrish galo v'savar shuhu chayev v'nimsa she'eno chayev. Now we have, I guess this must be a brisa of some kind, that if a person sets aside money for his machatzis shekel, thinking that he's chayev, and then it turns out that he's not chayev. Maybe he forgot that he already gave. Okay, so lo kadash. So the halacha is the coin or the coins do not become sanctified. Let's say a person sets aside 2 machatzis shekels. Maybe he thinks that last year he also forgot to give, or maybe he thinks that he needs to give for one of his family members when in reality they took care of themselves. But he thinks he has to sanctify 2 coins and really only has to sanctify 1. So ose hasheni ma ovidle. So what is the status of that second coin? It's one thing to say that when you're only sanctifying one thing and turns out you didn't need to, then that one thing is not sanctified. But if you needed to sanctify 1 out of 2, is there an argument to suggest that the second coin should be sanctified as well? So the Gemara says, Nishma'ena min hada. We may be able to prove it from the following. If a person sets aside money for a korban chatas and then realizes that he's not obligated, so then the money is really sanctified b'taus, it's done in error, and therefore the sanctity does not inhere in the coins. But then the brisa continues. If I think I need to bring 2 korbanos chatas and I only need to bring 1, so the money that I set aside really was not, I set aside too much money, so osa sheniya ma'at avadla. So here's the case where you really are designating 2 animals. So what do you do with the second animal? So elaroa, it has to graze until it develops a mum because kedusha has inhered in the animal. So therefore the Gemara wants to argue that in kind, hachanami elu linedava, that the second machatzis shekel that you in error designated also retains its kedusha and has to be given for nadav, has to be given for a gift offering in the temple. So the Gemara's question now is, this is the way the Korban Ha'eda learns, that the Gemara is now asking a question. And the question is, V'ka or V'hecha, Heich Omer Ata Elu. So the way that the Korban Ha'eda explains this, he says, Eich Ka'amart Hasheni Linadava. Why should the second coin be sanctified for Nadava? Lo Yehei Elakinotel Harbe Mos V'Amar Har'elu Lishkali. Why is this any different from a person who takes a fistful of coins and says, this is for my machatzis shekel, where according to Rav Bibi, all the surplus is chulin? So why don't we say the same thing over here? A person sets aside 2 coins when he only needs to set aside 1. We should say that the second coin is like the surplus coins and it should be chulin. This is not something that the Gemara answers. Apparently, it's okay in the Yerushalmi to leave off with a question and let's leave it as a question and then go on. In the Bavli, when that's done, the Gemara leaves off with the word kasha. And then the Gemara says, okay, we don't have an answer. But sometimes we don't have that style evident in the Yerushalmi. Let us go on. Rabbi Yehuda Omer v'chule. Rabbi Yehuda had argued that sometimes in history the machzis shekel that also did not have a fixed amount. Sometimes it was higher than a half shekel, like we talked about. So darkonos dinrin. So the word darkon is a reference to 3 half shekels. It's the equivalent of 1.5 silver shekels, and that's what people were originally called upon to give. I guess the first year when they were called upon to donate. Chazru lishkol sloim kishemuan. Then the next year they gave sloim, which is a full shekel. That's the way that's the literal meaning. And chazru lishkol tivin palge sloim. And then when it says that they later gave tivin, the word tiv'a or teva is a coin that is the equivalent of a half a shekel. Bikshu lishkol dinrin kartin velo kiblu alehen. And then they wanted to give the following year, they wanted to give even less than a half shekel, they wanted to give a quarter of a shekel, and that's what the Gemara translates as a kartin, and the rabbis did not accept that. They said, no, the minimum always will have to be every year a half shekel. Now, so the Gemara says this whole story that Rabbi Yehuda cites is min hada, is from the following pasuk in Sefer Nehemiah. Ve'emadnu aleinu mitzvos Laseis shlishis hashekel bashana laavodas beis Elokeinu, that we have established or accepted upon ourselves commandments to give 3 half shekels for the service of our Lord God in the year. So this is a proof that the first year that they asked for people's donations, they required everyone to give 3 half shekels or 1.5 shekels instead of the normative half shekel. Rabbi Chilkiya b'shem Rabbi Acha mikan shetzarech adam l'shalesh shkalo gimel pa'amim bashana. So one explanation of what this means is that a person should divide his charitable donations 3 times in the year, and so I think that's one way. That's one way of explaining what this means. And the Taklin Chadatin explains, La'olam al yimna adam mishlishis hashekel bashana dahenu shlish echad mishekel lechol hashana. Some also learn that it means that a person has to give a minimum of 1/3 of a shekel of charity every year. But that seems the girsa that we have in front of us is l'shalei shiklo gimel pama bashana, that a person should give donations of tzedakah 3 times a year. Another thing that we learn from here is mikan shein matrichan al hatzibur yoser megimel pama bashana. Also is that we don't make appeals more than 3 times a year. In other words, when the shul wants to make an appeal or the kehila wants to make an appeal, you don't make more than 3 appeals in the year. And Amar Rabbi Abin mikan legimel so'in mikan l'shalosh kupos, mikan l'gimel hafrashos. We're also going to see in the next parak, we're going to talk about the protocol of the Trumas Halishka. It's going to tell us that the boxes that they used to scoop up the coins, each box was 3 sa'as large. So that number 3 you get from the pasuk. We also learned that there had to be 3 boxes for each collection. And we also learned, and we're going to learn later on also, that they did the collection 3 times in the year, like we learned before, once before Pesach, once before Shavuos, and once before Sukkot. Ksiv. Yes.
A grammatical question?
Probably not, because the Yerushalmi is not precise in its grammar. So, I mean, you're welcome to, but my answer will probably be that you can't be medayik from grammar in Yerushalmi.
Because it's shalosh kupot and shalosh hafrashot before it says shlosha pamim. Is it a shalosh pamim?
As I said, yes. Okay. Ksiv ze yitnu kol ha'over ala pekudim. So the pasuk now says, when it talks about the donations of the machatzis shekel, it says, anyone who is passing to be counted has to give a machatzis shekel. So Rabbi Yehuda v'Rabbi Menachem yechad omer lefi shechatu b'machatzis hayom yitnu machatzis shekel. So what we learn is, the Gemara is now giving us a little bit of a gadata, and it's telling us that the reason for the mitzvah of machatzis shekel is a punishment or a way of atoning for the Cheta Egel. Because the Jews sinned at noon, in the middle of the day, at half day, so to speak, so we give a half coin to atone for the sin that was committed at half day. V'chad omar lefi shechatu b'sheishos b'yom yitnu machatzis shekel da'avad shita garmasim. And some say that it's got to do with the number 6, the Jewish people sinned at the 6th hour, which is another way of saying Chatzos Hayom, and therefore they have to give an equivalent of 6 garmasim, which is equal to a half a shekel. A garmas, says the Korban Ha'eda, was a denomination that was from a biblical time. Rabbi Yeshua be Rabbi Nechemia b'shem Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai lefi shavru al aseres hadibros yihiyanos en kol echad ve'echad asara geira. A shekel is 20 geiras, and that's actually defined by the Torah. And esrim geira yihiyah shekel. So a half a shekel is 10 geiras, and the reason why they have to give a half shekel is because they violated the 10 commandments in the course of worshiping the golden calf. It wasn't just idolatry, but it was really a totality of the whole violation of all 10 commandments, and so they have to atone for that by giving a coin that's worth 10 geiras. Rabbi Berechia, Rabbi Levi b'shem Reb Shimon ben Lakish, lefi shemachru b'chora shel Rachel be'esrim kesef, yihiyeh kol echad ve'echad poda es beno b'choro be'esrim kesef. Now we have a similar idea. Why is it that when you do Fri Jun haben, you have to use 5 shekels? The answer is that 5 shekels is equivalent to 20 kesef. It's because the word kesef means a dinar, which is a quarter of a shekel. So the reason why you do Fri Jun haben is to atone for the sin of the sale of Yosef by his brothers. And so just like they sold him for 20 dinars, you have to use 20 dinars to do Fri Jun haben. And related to that, going back to our discussion of the Machatzis HaShekel, Rabbi Pinchas b'shem Rabbi Levi lefi shemachru b'chora shel Rachel be'esrim kesef, and Yosef was the Bechor of Rachel. Nafal l'chol echad ve'echad mehem tiva lefichach yeh kol echad ve'echad nosen shiklo tiva. He says because the brothers sold the firstborn of Rachel, and they sold him for 20 kesef. How many brothers were there? There were 10 brothers. So it turns out that each brother pocketed 2 dinars, which is equivalent to a half of a shekel. And that's why the Jewish people, from that point onwards, have to give a machatzis shekel. So now we've seen that the machatzis shekel atones both for the Chet HaEgel and for Mechiras Yosef and for the sin of selling Yosef. Okay, and by the way, Chazal do make a correlation between Chet HaEgel and Mechiras Yosef in a number of places. You should know that the quintessential historical Aveira of Bein Adam Lamakom is the Chet HaEgel, and the quintessential Aveira Bein Adam Lachavero is Mechiras Yosef. And those are the 2 prototypes of Bein Adam Lachavero a sin and a Bein Adam Lamakom sin. Okay, next Mishnah. It's a good question.
The plate that they used to bring Yosef up, the same plate they threw in when they melted the gold, it says calf come up. Yosef is in a play on the word.
Okay, work on it. Mishnah.
In the Mishnah, the Gemara didn't talk about this. It says, Shavi mehem chatati. Did the person sin already, or he's worried that he may sin in the future, he's starting to collect already? Does it make a difference?
No, it seems like he's already sinned, and he knows he has to bring a korban chatas, and he's got to accumulate the money to purchase the animal.
Put in every day a little, just in case.
In anticipation, no, because how do you know if you're ever going to have to bring a korban chatas? Yeah, but not necessarily a chatas. How do you know you're going to? A chatas is something for which
the assumption is that he sinned already.
Yeah. The next Mishnah, I believe so. Mosar shkalim chulin. So the leftover shkalim, money that you accumulated for shkalim, whatever left over shall be chulin. And as you saw, we saw machlokas between Rabbi Bibi and Rabbi Yossi how to interpret this line. According to Rabbi Bibi, it's when you've got a fistful of shkalim. Here everyone agrees that the leftover, the surplus, is chulin. And according to Rabbi Yossi, this only goes according to Beis Hillel when you're accumulating the coins slowly. Mosar asiris ha'efa, whatever's left over from money that is collected for the 10th of an efa. Now that's an ambiguous statement, because when is a 10th of an efa brought? It's either brought on a daily basis by the Kohen Gadol, or it's brought by a poor person when he sins and he can't afford an animal. So we'll talk about this in a moment. But Mosar kane zavin, kane zavos, v'kane yoldos, that if you have leftover money for purchases of purification sacrifices for a zav, or a woman who's given birth to a child, chatos va'ashamos, or if you have money for purchasing a chatos or an asham, in all of those cases, mosar nedava, whatever's left over is for nedava. Zeh klal, this is the general rule, kol shehu ba l'shem chatos umishum ashma mosar nedava. Anything that is coming to atone or purify for sin, like chatas and asham, the leftover surplus is for nedava. Mosar ola la ola, whatever's left over for an ola sacrifice should be used for a future ola sacrifice. Mosar mincha la mincha, the same thing for a carbon mincha, whatever surplus is for a future mincha. Mosar shlamim l'shlamim, same thing for a shlamim. Mosar ha-pesach l'shlamim, whatever's left over for a carbon pesach should be used for a carbon shlamim, because you can only bring one carbon pesach. Mosar nazirim l'nazirim, if you have leftover money, let's say a community is making a collection for nazirim in general, and we want to be able to pay for the nazirim of our community to be able to bring their karbanos. If we have leftover surplus money, save that for future nazirim. But mosar nazir linadava. But if an individual nazir is accumulating money, then whatever leftover he has, since he doesn't have to hold it for a future nazirism, that money shall go for nadava. The Gemara now says, Amar Rabbi Yossi, Ada ana taman shamayis kal Rav Yehuda shal lishmuel. When I was in Bavel, I heard the two Babylonian Amoraim, Rav Yehuda, speak to Shmuel and ask him the following question. Hifri shkalo vames. What's the halacha if a person sets aside his machatzis a shekel, rachmana litzlan, and then he passes away? So Amar le yiplu l'nedava. That money goes for nedava. It's still sanctified. So Mosar Asiris Ha'efa Shalo. Then the Gemara now talks about another case. A Kohen Gadol sets aside his money for the Asiris Ha'efa, and it turns out that he has a surplus. So Rabbi Yochanan Amar Yolichem Liyam HaMelech. Rabbi Yochanan says that surplus cannot be used for anything. It has to be completely destroyed by being thrown into the Yam HaMelech. Rabbi Elazar Amar Yiplu L'Nedava. And Rabbi Elazar says, no, it can be used for future gift karbanos. Masnisa Pligal Rabbi Yochanan. It seems, therefore, that our Mishnah contradicts Rabbi Yochanan, because our Mishnah says that Mosar shkolim chulin, Mosar asiris ha'efa, Mosar kanizavim, kanizavos, Mosar kaniyoldos, chatos v'shamos, Mosar nedava. That included in this list of things that the surplus is nedava is asiris ha'efa, the 10th of the efa. So the Gemara answers, Ma avad la Rabbi Yochanan, what is he going to do with that? So pasula, Mosar asiris ha'efa shal minchas chote shal kol Yisrael. He says that line in the Mishnah is not talking about the asiris ha'efa of the Kohen Gadol, which is unique and can only be used by that Kohen Gadol for that day, and therefore if anything's left over it has to be destroyed. But our Mishnah is talking about the mincha of a poor person, where the Torah makes an allowance that if he cannot afford an animal, he can bring a flour offering instead. Whatever's left over from his accumulated cash for that purpose can be used to be put in the pushka for karbanos nedava. Rabbi Yossi Omar Alda Olil Abba Barba. The following issue was raised as a question by Abba Barba, which is as follows: the Inan Omrin, because people say minayin they say in Bavel really is what it means. Minayin shah Pesach mishtana l'shem shlamim. How do we know that if you have a lamb that was set aside as a korban Pesach and you offer it on the wrong day, that it automatically converts to a shlamim? This is all Maseches Psachim, if you recall. Talmud Loimar v'im min hatzon karbano lezevach shlamim. That the Torah, when it talks about the korban shlamim, it says that if something is for sheep, its korban shall be for a shlamim, which teaches me kol shu min hatzon bashlamim, that any animal that is supposed to be brought from sheep, if for whatever reason it can't be brought for its own purpose, such as the korban Pesach, not on the 14th of Nisan, it shall be instead brought as a shlamim. So that's our source text. So hey sevon. So the question therefore is as follows: Hare ola min hatzon. So we have a similar pasuk by korban ola. So maybe I could argue, and the way the korban ha'eda learns this pasuk, dil mahai lezevach shlamim lemosar ola dekarev shlamim kaasi. Maybe only if you have surplus money for an ola, which is also brought from Tzon, do you bring it as a shlamim? Maybe the pasuk's not talking about a korban pesach at all. So the Gemara answers, Davar she'eno ba ela min hatzon, yatzas ola shehi ba afilu min habakar. The answer is because the pasuk, when it says v'im min hatzon, means that we're talking about a korban that exclusively can only be brought from tzon, right? From a class of animal called tzon. So that's to the exclusion of an ola. It can't be addressing what you do with surplus ola monies, because an ola can be brought both from tzon and from bakar and from cattle. So therefore, it's not addressing surplus ola money. It's only referring to surplus Pesach money or animals. So heisevon harei asham. So now the next question is, well, listen, a korban asham can only be brought from a sheep, can only be brought from tzon. And so maybe the pasuk is telling you that if you have surplus ashams, then you bring them as a shlamim, but it's got nothing to do with korban pesach. Amar Rabbi Bon bar Kahana min hatzon, davar shehu ba mikol hatzon, yatsa asham sheino ba ela min ha'elim bilvad. The answer is that when the pasuk talks about the shlamim, it says v'im min hatzon. That language seems to imply that any type of tzon can be brought as a korban, and it must therefore not be addressing an asham. An asham can only be brought from rams, which is a certain type of tzon, which is a 2-year-old sheep. But an asham cannot be brought as a goat, for example. And therefore, when the pasuk says that all tzon are inclusive in this law about bringing them as a shlamim, it must be referring to surplus korban pesachs, not surplus korban ashams that are brought as shlamims. So the Gemara then says, B'chol asar at omar min lemayit, bekanat omar min lerabos? Question mark. I don't understand, says the Gemara. You're telling me that the verbiage of the pasuk of v'im min hatzon is coming to include all different kinds of tzon? What, from the word min? Min is usually a miyut, it's an exclusionary clause. How can you tell me now that the word min is an inclusionary clause to include all different kinds of tzon? So the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Mana hachanami min lemait miyut she'eno ba ben shtei shanim, miyut she'eno ba min nekeva. So the Gemara says, you're right. The word min in the pasuk by shlamim is not a riboy. It's not to include all tzon. It's actually coming to exclude certain kinds of tzon that cannot be brought as a shlamim, such as a 2-year-old animal or a female sheep. But rather, like the Korban Ha'edah speaks out, what is the inclusionary aspect of this pasuk? Where's the riboy? Because it says ha-tzon. Ha-tzon means all tzon in general, generically all tzon. So therefore, v'gabe asham nami min l'mayitu, she'eno ba ela min ha'elam bilvad. And by asham too, you also have this exclusionary, this miyut, that tells you that an asham can only be brought as a ram, and it cannot be brought as any other kind of tzon. But the bottom line is that it makes more sense to say that the pasuk of the imin hatzon by shlamim is talking about when you have a surplus korban pesach, that surplus korban pesach is brought as a shlamim and not a surplus of any other animal. So we've knocked out ola, we've knocked out asham. So heisevon v'aksiv v'imin hatzon karbano min hakvasim o min ha'izim la'ola me'ata moser ha'pesach ba'ola. But 1 second, I have another pasuk which talks about the korban ola. And there the korban ola says v'im min hatzon, also the same kind of language. So maybe I'll argue that when you have a surplus pesach, it's not brought as a shlamim, but rather it's brought as an ola. So Amar Rebbe Abon, mishanin davar shehu la'achila l'davar shehu la'achila, ve'in mishanin davar shehu la'achila l'davar she'eno la'achila. The answer is, you're right. You have the same verbiage by the korban ola, but if you need to attach surplus pesachs to a certain kind of korban, it makes more sense to attach it to a shlamim, which is also an edible korban, more so than to attach it to the ola, which is a non-edible korban. And the korban pesach is an edible korban, so it's more analogous to the shlamim. Amar Rabbi Yossi bar Rebbe Bon, Mishanim Kodshim Kalam L'Shem Kodshim Kalam Mishanim Kodshim Kalam L'Shem Kodshe Kodshim. Another reason why it's more analogous, the Korban Pesach, to Shlamim and not to Ola, is because both Pesach and Shlamim are Kodshim Kalam, are a lighter level of Kodshim, and the Ola is Kodshe Kodshim, a higher level of Kodshim, so it's more logical to attach the surplus Korban Pesach to a Shlamim than it is to attach it to an Ola. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Al Da Olil Rabbi Chanina. The following challenge was raised by Rabbi Chanina. The Einon Amrin Eina Pesach Mishtana L'Shem Shlamim Ela Imkein Shachta L'Shem Shlamim. The Babylonians argue that the only time that when I shecht a surplus korban Pesach, meaning I shecht it on a day that's not Yud Daled Nisan, that it has the status of a shlamim is only if I shecht it with a shlamim in mind. Va'ani Omer Afilu Shachta L'Shem Ola. But I, Rabbi Chanina, say I hold that even if you shechted it for the sake of an ola, it still retains its status automatically as a shlamim. Amar Rabbi Ila, time of the Rabbi Yochanan, imin hatzon karbano lezevach shlamim. So what's Rabbi Yochanan's reasoning to say that any surplus paschal sacrifice automatically converts to a shlamim? Because it says imin hatzon karbano lezevach shlamim, like the pasuk that we said before, kol shehu zevach ba shlamim. So anything that is a korban that cannot be used for its own purpose converts for a shlamim. So umishtana, so kol shehu zevach, anything that has to be brought shall be and cannot be brought for itself shall be brought as a shlamim. So now the question is like this. The Gemara is now asking a question. Mishtana lemachsheves psul heichavida. So the question is, the way the Korban Ha'ida learns, Im shachtu l'shem ola mi bayale. Im osa ha'machshava poseles, ba'ola poseles gambo olo. Let's say, meaning, so in other words, Rabbi Yochanan's argument is, the reason why that even when I thought about shechting it for an ola, it still retains the status of a shlamim is because of this gzeras hakasuv, that unconditionally the animal retains its status of a shlamim. So now the question is as follows. What if this surplus korban Pesach, I'm shechting it for the sake of an ola, and I have a machshava pesula at the same time, something that would passel the korban ola. So for example, heichavida. So what's the case? Shachta l'shem ola, al manas lizrok dama l'machar. If, let's say, I shechted it for the sake of an ola, and also had in mind that I was going to do the zrika, the sprinkling of the blood, not today, but tomorrow. So the Gemara says, Mikol makom pasulhu. So the Gemara says, what difference does it make if it's for the sake of an ola or for the sake of a shlamim? In either case, you've pasuled the korban with that kind of machshava. So the Gemara says, no, my question is as follows. In temer mishtana l'machsheves psul upigul, in tomer ein mishtana l'machsheves psul pigul. My question is like this. If this animal retains its status of a shlamim completely, despite the fact that I was thinking about an ola, then granted that the animal will be puzzled because I had this machshava of zrika. But thinking about doing the zrika tomorrow will not render this animal pigul. Pigul is where I have in mind to do an avoda after the animal's expiration date has already arrived. Yeah. Since a shlamim's expiration date is not until tomorrow night, not tomorrow day, so then I wouldn't be considered to be doing an act of pigul. But since I thought about it being an ola, perhaps you can argue not that way. Perhaps you can argue that I'm also liable kares for doing an act of pigul because the expiration date for an ola is tomorrow morning. So if I had in mind to do zrika tomorrow day, so then maybe I'm liable for pigul as well. This is a question that the Gemara leaves unanswered. Next, lishmo v'shelo lishmo b'shar yemos hashana. Now let's say I have the following machshava. I have a paschal lamb surplus left over, and I shecht it not on the 14th, either before the 14th of Nisan or after the 14th of Nisan. So, if I have a machshava stam, if I don't think about anything, then automatically the animal reverts to a shlamim. But let's say I shecht it lishmo v'shelo lishmo. I'm thinking both about a korban Pesach and about a shlamim. Now we learned in Maseches Psachim that if you shecht an animal l'shem Pesach not on the 14th of Nisan, the animal is puzzled. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
So here the question is like this: what if you shecht it for lishmo and shelo lishmo at the same time, right? Or one right after the other while you're doing the shechita. We had this sugya in Psachim as well, but I don't remember what we said over there. So Rabbi Bon bar Chia b'shem Shmuel bar Abba mekeven she'en lo shem nasu kishochta lishmo b'shelo lishmo b'shesika v'hu kasha. There's a number of different ways to understand this, but basically the way it works is like this. Since this animal has not been specifically designated as a shlamim, but it defaults as a shlamim ips or de facto, so therefore the fact that I designated it as a Pesach and at the same time designated it as a Shlomim, the two cancel each other out, and it reverts back to its default or de facto position of being a Shlomim, and therefore it's kosher. So Amrlei im Kenhu afilu shachtu lishmo al manas lizrok damo shelo lishmo ye'asa misha rishana keshachtu lishmo v'shelo lishmo b'shasika v'yehi kosher. So then, if by that argument, let me push this a little bit further. He says, let's say you take this Paschal lamb that is not on the 14th of Nisan, and you shecht it exclusively l'shem Pesach, which would normally invalidate it. But while you're shechting it, you're thinking, I'm going to do the zrika for the sake of a shlamim. So perhaps you could argue that the same thing as well, that the machshava that you have for the zrika cancels out the machshava that you have for the shechita, and therefore it defaults back to its de facto position of being a shlamim, and it should be kosher. So Amar Rebbe Abba Mari Ma Nomer Bishasika Kosher O Nomar Bishasika Pasul. And he says no. His argument, and it's a little bit difficult to read this into the words, but he says, like the Taklin Chadatin speaks out, since you did an entire one avoda of shchita, having in mind that you're going to be doing it for the Shem Korban Pesach, that makes it pasul. And therefore we cannot sanction that as being a kosher shlamim. In that situation, since the entire shtika was done exclusively l'shem korban pesach, that will invalidate the korban, even though your intention was to do the zrika l'shem shlamim. Have a wonderful day.